Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. It's been a little while, but we're so happy to be sharing this webinar with you again. And Kyle Swain, ANZ Director of Lpc Cresa, is joining us for our usual weekly webinar about COVID-19 weekly retail health check. And Kyle, we are touching back on some new topics and also introducing some new ones today.
Yeah, definitely. The events of the last 2 weeks particularly have led to covering this topic, plus it's halfway through the period. So, yeah, there's some things that have come up previously in question and answer time that this covers off, and I think a number of retailers are sort of facing this situation at the moment. So we'll go from there.
All right, no worries. And everybody, just a reminder, this is also a Q&A session, so don't be shy. Whatever you're thinking, 10 other people are most likely thinking it as well. So if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box, or the Q&A throughout the session, and we'll answer them towards the end.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, so today's focus is how to revisit, amend or extend previous agreements. So I'm going to assume that everyone listening in today did manage to get a rental agreement in place in the first 3 months of COVID, and particularly after we covered off how to finalise agreements 3 or 4 weeks ago. So everything we're talking about today is essentially assuming that you do have an agreement in place, but there may be a need to revisit that. So we're going to talk about some examples of when you may need to do that and what provisions are in place for you to be able to do that and how to go about it. Hopefully there will be some specific questions at the end that I can respond to. I find real life situations are always very good to give examples to and explain the situation a lot better. So we'll jump to the next slide, Jess. So obviously agreements may need to be revisited. A number of times in the past we've talked about having caveats on any agreement. There's always been talk of a potential second wave, and what if the government closes shops down again and things like that. And unfortunately, we've seen that situation arise last week in Melbourne, and we're dealing with a number of situations in Victoria at the moment where retailers have been affected for a second time and have had to close their businesses or are deeply affected in terms of turnover. So the types of agreements that would give rise to wanting to revisit them. Some of the agreements initially dealt with let's do 50% rent relief for April to June, and let's take a wait and see approach as to what we need to provide for July, August and September. They obviously now are in that period and need to be revisited. Some agreements have been made for the full response period based on an early assessment. So if you perhaps put an agreement in place in April for 20% or 30% rent relief for the 6 months, but now it's clear that the level of impact you're receiving is much larger than that, you need to revisit that. Obviously Victoria, we've mentioned, affected by this second lockdown period, so any agreements in place would no doubt need to be revisited and amended. Some agreements were made very early on in March and late March, particularly the last week of March, when the government mandated that certain businesses like restaurants and particularly gyms had to close. So some agreements were reached in that period before the Code of Conduct came out on April 7. So those agreements may need to be amended during the period. And then there has been a case of some agreements that have some restrictions in it where the some clauses in the agreement might restrict the operation of the code, and what we call contracted out in the legal sense. So there are all the types of situations that you may want to go back to a landlord and revisit what was agreed, and hopefully negotiate a stronger position for yourself to get your business through the period. So we'll pop on to the next one. Yes, are you able to revisit agreements and make changes, seek a higher level of relief, or extend the relief period? So there's a couple of different things we'll look at here. Legal provisions, firstly. And each state obviously brought in legislation around in order to give effect to the code. So whether it was a regulation or an actual bill or act, but each state brought in its own legislation giving effect to the code, and each state is a little bit different on the provisions around amending agreements after they've been agreed to or negotiated on, and what conditions they can be renegotiated under. I just mentioned the contract out part. There is, I'll use an example in WA, in the provisions over there. The agreement is of no effect if it purports to exclude or restrict the operation of the Act. So if or a purported waiver or a right or benefit of the tenant is also not allowed. So you can't put a clause in an agreement stating that some right or benefit of the tenant under the code has to be waived in order to get that agreement. And we have seen examples of that. A retailer was offered an agreement subject to not being able to revisit that agreement if there was a second wave. So that's an example of contracting out rights or benefits of the tenant, which can't happen. And the WA legislation particularly is very clear on that. And the final one is just where there's a caveat, where you've been able to put a caveat into an agreement. At Lpc Cresa, we very early on made sure that every agreement had that caveat written into it, that should the situation change dramatically, or a second wave or a second lockdown, or anything that significantly changed the financials for the tenant, then we reserve the right to revisit it. We'll have a bit of a closer look at the legal provisions on the next page, Jess. And I've just jotted some examples of what the different states have in their provisions. So I'm not sure where you are all sitting, but it is worth looking up your legislation for your state or territory. I've said before, you can find that on Lpc Cresa's website under our resources page. We've logged all of the individual states and territories legislation documents in there for you to access. So in Queensland, you can ask to negotiate a further reduction in rent during the response period. It's written into legislation. Landlord can't refuse you coming back and asking to revisit that. What is in the legislation for both Queensland and Victoria, though, is that if you revisit the agreement and renegotiate it, the second time round, the landlord doesn't have to provide 50% as waived rent, whereas the code says at least 50% has to be waived and no more than 50% can be deferred. That one part of the code is null and void when we go back and negotiate a new agreement a second time in both Victoria and Queensland. In saying that, we revert to the code again, and all of these things are by agreement, so it's a negotiated thing. It doesn't mean you have to agree to those terms. You may choose to leave the agreement as it is in the first agreement rather than getting a new agreement where suddenly the additional rent relief is all deferred rather than waived. In Victoria, the tenant can make a further request and they have to follow the same process as is laid out in that legislation and would have been followed on the first occasion. And in Western Australia, and I like their legislation over there, if financial circumstances change after the agreement has been made, then you can make a further request. And if any agreement was made before the code, and a tenant feels that they're at a disadvantage or terms for relief under the code would be more favourable to them, then they can make a request to revisit that and negotiate under the code. And we did see this in Perth, where a landlord, a client we were representing was presented with an offer prior to this legislation coming out with a time frame on it requiring our client to agree to the rent relief being offered and indicating that it can't be revisited. So this stuff was happening, but the legislation says that if you did agree to something prior to the code coming out, then you can revisit it. New South Wales, unfortunately, is a bit silent on this. If you're in New South Wales, I would use these as principles from other states. It doesn't say it doesn't apply, it just doesn't say that it does. They're the main points I wanted to get across today in the talking time to it, and I'm hoping there's lots of questions around this and that we can talk through a few specific examples. So I think that's the next slide, right, Jess?
This is the previous slide in case people had to read over again if they had questions.
Okay, yeah, good. Thank you. And
okay, we have a question here from John. In relation to Queensland and Victoria dropping the minimum 50% waiver in the extended term, I was wondering how the mediator would handle a dispute.
Well, interesting, John. Obviously, we haven't had any of these disputes as yet because this only just happened and people might be only just addressing this, but going on disputes that we've handled, so at Lpc Cresa we have sat in on mediation in New South Wales, particularly with one client down there, and the process was very good mediation. I would think that despite the provisions there that we've talked about not being required by law to provide 50% as waived, I don't think that would change how the mediators are addressing that. The mediation sessions themselves are purely a negotiated outcome between the two parties on the day, or hopefully reaching a negotiated outcome. I think if it did go to a dispute situation, there would be ample opportunity to negotiate a fair and reasonable outcome, despite the law saying that the landlord isn't required to provide 50% waive. It's been the case pretty much all through this that there's a lot of grey area, and we continually revert back to the intent of the code and the impact of the offer being made, whether it's deferred or waived, and remembering that we want to stay away from deferred as much as possible.
Okay, just a question from me, Kyle. Do you see any common trends in these negotiations or mediations that you think our participants should be aware of? Are there any commonalities that you've seen?
Yeah, I guess the interpretation of month to month to month to month over the 6 months. So it's been very difficult for a lot of people to lock down an agreement because landlords are not agreeing to any rent relief for a period that hasn't already been impacted. Whereas, again, using Western Australia as an example, and if you happen to be in Western Australia, I think you're a bit lucky in this situation, but the Small Business Commissioner's Office out over there put out an advice that said that the impact should be measured similar to the ATO JobKeeper assessment, in measure the impact over an assessment period, perhaps April, and to issue a request to the landlord based on that impact, and the landlord is to provide rent relief for the entire response period based on that assessment period. What we're finding in effect is that landlords want to look at this month and provide you with 32% this month, and then next month provide them with actual results, and they'll provide some relief next month as well. And that's made it very difficult to lock down agreements and to, I guess, get consistency across and some confidence for this pandemic period. So that's probably been the biggest challenge that most people would be experiencing.
Yes, that's what Suzanne has written here. It's not so much as a question as it is a statement. She says, this is what my landlord is doing month by month until June, and I still have no offer from them. So do you think Susan can expect an offer anytime soon, or do you think the landlord's holding out?
I'm not sure. Susan, just type what state you're in as well, because there is Queensland. So in Queensland, Susan, in the legislation, the landlord is required to provide an offer within 30 days, I think. 30 days.
Okay, because she is in Queensland.
Yeah, so I just saw that come up. Thank you. So, Susan, you are entitled to put a little bit of pressure on them to provide a formal offer. Now, the offer might be that on a monthly basis, we will require your sales figures and we'll provide proportional rent relief monthly. That might be their agreement, but they do have to document that and provide that offer within 30 days of you lodging a formal request. And so if you were sitting in on one of the previous weeks where I pretty much laid out the process, you might go to, again, these are on our website resource page under the webinars and also on the NRA's YouTube channel. So you might go back and find this one, but it lays out essentially the items you have to provide, be very specific with what you're requesting, e.g. 100% rent relief as waived rent or whatever it is that you're chasing. And once you've lodged that with the landlord formally in writing, there is a time frame that they have to reply. So they can't just keep you in the dark about what they're going to do from month to month.
Do you recommend, what materials do you recommend that tenants come prepared with when approaching their landlord for rental relief and mediation?
Yeah, well, in the past, in terms of making a formal request, the key elements have to be ticked off. The evidence that you are an eligible business under an eligible entity under the JobKeeper program. So something from the ATO advising or as proof of it and evidence of you being eligible for the JobKeeper program, not having just applied but being eligible. Something in writing from your accountant to state that you are an SME entity, so you're an eligible entity, i.e. your business turns over less than 50 million per year, and your proof of impact, so the sales performance. And in a previous one, in a previous webinar, I gave an example of a spreadsheet that we used that we also get the tenant's accountant to sign off so that we don't have to show them BAS statements and P&Ls and things like that. Now, I think Susan just added something there.
Yes, so she has written, first off, thank you, my landlord has everything in writing. And second, are they entitled to know how much I receive from subsidies?
Kind of yes and no. No, they don't need specific details. What they, under the code, there's two components really. One, acting in good faith, that both parties should work together and share information, necessary information, so to assess the impact on the business. I've said before, landlords often revert to how they respond in normal circumstances when it's not a pandemic, and if they're going to put their hands in their pockets, they want to make sure that everyone else has put their hands in their pockets. And so it is fair and reasonable that they want to know that the franchisor has waived your royalties fees for the period or something like that, if they're going to also contribute. They are somewhat fixated on the fact that you should be receiving relevant government grants and things like that. I don't believe there's anywhere in the code or the legislation that requires you to show them what or how much you have received, and it's not counted as revenue, so it shouldn't be assessed. It should not be assessed as a part of your business's revenues in terms of diminishing the impact of COVID-19. This particularly evident. We have a client at the moment who's a childcare centre, and the childcare grant system was the only revenue that childcare centres earned during that period. And we had a landlord who insisted that was to be considered as revenue, but the ATO is very clear that it's not revenue and it's not taxable income, and it's certainly not related to comparable sales data. So hopefully that gives a real life example of that being put into play.
Let's see. Well, thank you everybody for your questions, because we have gotten a couple of more since then, and we will get to them in time. Susan says, I agree, it's not revenue. If I didn't provide, they would not make an offer.
Yeah, that's not in good faith. And look, Susan, you're probably on the precipice of lodging a dispute to have a mediator address those things if the landlord's not willing to. But unfortunately, may be forced to go down that route if they're not going to act in good faith and accept the evidence that you've provided as sufficient and accurate.
No, it doesn't sound like good faith at all, which is unfortunate. So hopefully, Susan, you can get into contact with a mediator. And yes, I am not getting anywhere with them, unfortunately, she says. But Susan, if you need any more help, please email marketing@nra.net.au with your situation and any other questions, and I will forward it on to Kyle for you. We will get to the next question from Mark, who says, do you think it is reasonable for landlords to claw back some of the rent if turnover in a particular month was higher than the previous year? For example, if we had April down 80%, May down 40%, June up 20%, and relief was provided for April and May proportionate to decline in turnover.
It's an interesting one, Mark. Depends on what agreement they agreed to. If they wanted to do a quarterly agreement and documented that, then the process essentially they're using is like an outgoings process where you set up an estimate at the start of the financial period, and you pay a monthly amount based on that estimate, and then at the end of the financial period you do a statement as in the outgoings process, and if there is a variation to a shortfall or an overpayment, then it's corrected at the end of that quarter. If that was the agreement that the two parties agreed to, then I don't have any problem with 2 months being down, 1 month being up, and it levels out. If they're addressing each month on an individual basis, then absolutely not. They have no right to claw back any if you have a good month, because my argument would be that really, if normal sales are 20% or 40% up on last year, then the impacted months are the difference to last year plus the 40% that you should be up. So I would try that argument with them. They should technically on the other months be providing you with 60 or 70% reduction rather than just the 30 or 40.
Do you believe that Mark requires something in writing to present to his landlord if they keep bringing up this issue?
Yeah, look, again, I don't know what agreement is in place and whether they're addressing it on a month-to-month basis or a quarterly basis, but there is nowhere in the code that says a landlord can claw back if a tenant has one good month, or suddenly the initial impact of the first couple of months evens out into more normal retail performance.
Okay.
I would be very surprised if the next month again was down, unless Mark sells toilet paper and everyone's gone out and hoarded that in that month. No, I would expect that Mark's business might be back on level footing for the remainder of the period, and they won't be required to provide any more rent relief, but they can't claw any back from that first 2 months, no.
No, okay. So hopefully that answers your question there, Mark.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, and the first out of these 2 is from Shivji. He has a bit of a story here. Starting off, hi, my landlord is extremely slow in responding. I have 2 shops in the same centre in New South Wales. One of them is out of lease and the other is in holdover. For this shop, I have requested a reduction in rent for 12 months in lieu of reduction under the code. For this, they have asked me to provide 5 years of financials and cash flow statements. I have declined to provide this as I intend to enter into a new lease with a smaller tenancy, later on. I am considering informing the landlord about vacating in the next 6 weeks to make them respond quicker and reach an agreement sooner. What would your advice be on this situation?
I kind of didn't completely understand that. So if it's okay, I might get that sent through to me by email, Jess. Yep. I might deal with that one offline, because there's a bit more detailed, because it's sort of applying the code but negotiating something outside of the code, leveraging a stay-go situation against all of that, and it's very complex. So there might be a couple of other questions that I could deal with in 1 or 2 minutes each that we'll get through, and I'll deal with that one outside of the webinar, if that's all right.
Yeah, no worries. So Shivji, can you please type in your best email address into the chat, and I'll grab it off there and send the question through to Kyle. We have our last question here from Maria, who asks, I am an eligible entity, small, medium enterprise, but impact on turnover is less than 30% to be eligible for JobKeeper. Am I still eligible for rent relief?
Yeah, look, we go back to the absolute take-home message of the mandatory code of conduct, the national code of conduct that it applies to all commercial leases. Now, the intent and the principles, the overarching principles all apply to every single lease there is, whether it's been proven to be impacted by 30% or more, whether it turns over less than 50 million or over 50 million, the code still applies that, or the principles of the codes. What it does require is two parties that are willing to apply those principles and the intent of the code to achieve what the code is all about, which is continuity of business, both parties coming out the other end in as best shape as possible. So 20% impact for a business can be extremely significant. A really small entity, mum and dad, owner-operator, one-shop business impacted by 20%. Retailing in the pre-COVID environment, don't expect many of them have 3 to 6 months of cash flow behind them. So suddenly being down 20% on that is the difference between being viable and being insolvent. So those sorts of conversations need to be had with a landlord to get them on board with providing some assistance in line with the code, but recognising that it's not a mandatory component. So I would hope that that's achievable, but it really is down to the skill and experience of the person who is having that conversation with the landlord and what the past relationship has been with the landlord, the length of lease term remaining, and all of those other things need to be a part of that conversation. It's a difficult situation, but we would certainly, and we have with a number of clients, approached landlords in that similar situation outside of the code and still managed to achieve some benefit for the tenant.
Okay, well, everyone here is agreeing with you and saying thank you for your advice, particularly Mark, who said thank you. This is not a position we thought we would be in, particularly in COVID and having the landlord trying to claw back rent. So that seems to be everything for today. I will forward Shivji's inquiry onto you, Kyle, and you can explore that more in depth with him.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's the first time I've ever heard that one as well, a clawback. I'll be interested in a follow-up, Mark, as to how that turns out.
Yes, very much so. So everybody who has stayed on, the email to send inquiries to is marketing@nra.net.au, and we will forward your inquiries onto Kyle and he will answer them as best he can and as fast as he possibly can, because LPC is very busy at the moment, but we're lucky that they've always had time out of their busy calendars to join us week to week to answer these questions. So thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Well, I think fortnightly at the moment is a good option, but there's very definitely a need to remain available to your members and to tenants generally to provide some solutions for the problems they're facing at the moment, and that's essentially what LPC Cresa do, is provide solutions to retail tenants and all commercial tenants, commercial, industrial and retail. But we'll come back in 2 weeks if that's okay, and I'm not sure what the topic will be then, but it'll be something that a lot of people are asking questions about and experiencing in these dealings with their landlords.
Most definitely. And for people who are in Victoria, our thoughts are definitely with you. Everyone, please stay safe and we will see you in a fortnight. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks everyone for being on. Cheers.